Everyone, it's Alex, and today I'm here to do the favorite fiction books book tag. So Juan from Just One Reader actually tagged me in his own iteration of this tag, so thank you, Juan. But this tag is actually because of Steve from Steve Donahue whenever he watched Olive at a Book Olive do a video talking about her own favorite fiction books. And if you've been watching me for a while, you would probably know that my go-to is contemporary literary fiction, although I would consider myself kind of a balanced reader between fiction, classics, and nonfiction. So initially, whenever Juan tagged me, I thought to myself, like, okay, this is going to be pretty easy, but I was very mistaken, mainly because of these awful rules that Steve took it upon himself to create, which are very good rules because it made me think so much about what I consider to be my favorite fiction books. And one primary rule being that it has to be novels within the 21st century, so I can't name my beloved Woolf or any Austens that I love. And notice that I said novels, so I can't even mention short story collections, and there are two right off the bat I could think of mentioning. And really, when I think of recommending books to people, I frequently actually recommend nonfiction, so I can't even recommend any essay collections or memoirs. But with the 10 novels, they don't have to be ranked or anything, so the only exception being that whatever you pick as your number one does have to be truly your number one fiction novel that you abide by, or you would swear by, or you would basically die for. And another caveat has to be that at least one of the books on my list has to somehow relate to another list from someone else doing this tag, and I am going to base it off what Steve said about selecting The Interestings by Meg Wolitzer, which is truly one of the worst books I've ever read. So have no fear, but I will definitely give a much better recommendation that I think is in like the similar realm of what The Interestings tried to do, and yeah, I'll be sure to mention that. So again, imagining that this list kept me up for some reason like late into the night thinking about it so frequently, my first pick I wanted to mention was Duck's Newburyport by Lucy Ellman. I decided to put this one on my list because I feel like it talks so well about rural America in such stark contrast to how in our world we try to always promote how connected we feel, and how Duck's Newburyport tries to talk about narratively and also within its story how we cannot get displaced within these grander narratives, but also not necessarily trying to combat that. And by no means is this story specific, because as a lot of people know, this story spans 1,000 pages, and to me I felt like it was a gesture or a demonstration of really getting at wondering as a reader whether I feel like the world is often what shapes what I think, or is it the memories that we feel worth keeping, like maybe with the stories in the books we read, or really just with reading in general, how those sort of create our own legacy. Therefore, I feel like Lucy Ellman nearly creates this sense of distraction intentionally, kind of wondering what we'll do with this saturation of information. Which, truthfully, at the end of this book, I didn't feel like every minor detail mattered, but I feel like what it did really well was focus on the location of Ohio. Personally speaking, with me being familiar with Ohio as a region, I think it only enforces that sense of rural America being both beloved but also abandoned, forcing me to consider how books, or at least any prolonged story, is meant in some way to ever have to mean anything to me, which doesn't always have to be exactly the point. Up next, I wanted to mention A Single Man by Christopher Isherwood. This is a story about a man named George who's an English professor that actually reveals to the reader that he just lost his lover. We as the reader become a confidant to George as he is a closeted gay man, and by forming this close relationship between George and ourselves as the reader, it never really feels like he has to do that step at explaining himself, or at least explaining his sexuality. Which really made me wonder if the whole time George had greater difficulty explaining his grief or his sexuality more, kind of championing how we put our feelings on a totem pole, even whenever it's feelings that make us feel awful. And me using this totem pole comparison, kind of how maybe we determine if we do ourselves a disservice, or maybe we're being generous to ourselves whenever we try to consider how we interact with the world. This book, while short, is also one of my favorite books that I feel like depicts loneliness really well, which is always one of my favorite themes that I gravitate towards. Speaking of loneliness, I wanted to mention next The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is one of the best executed novels I've ever read, and probably has one of my favorite endings too. This story follows a man named Stevens, who's a butler who's actually on vacation since being allowed to go on one from his employer, employer. And it's funny that I give such a glowing endorsement of how I liked this book and how executed that I think it is, like well executed, but truthfully as I was reading it, I wouldn't say I was exactly always engaged. I think its reward is definitely in its overall package, as Stevens himself kind of feels like he went through this revelation of seeking solace in his memories. Being such a devout butler, Stevens never really gave himself that chance for self-reflection during his job, and so with the story being a progression of looking back on his memories, it feels really sentimental and intimate and really special. And I think that capability of reminding me what I feel like is one of the greatest things we can do as human beings is being able to self-reflect and kind of assess how maybe we wish things could be different than what they really were. And it's my sympathy towards Stevens' nostalgic journey and also Ishiguro's wonderful writing that really put me in a trance whenever I was reading this, and I just felt really fulfilled at the end. Up next, I have Summer by Ellie Smith. It might be premature for me to mention this on this list, being read so recently when I think about all the books I read that were published in the 21st century, but I really feel like Summer will go down as a future classic with the sense of it being this culmination between Smith's seasonal quartet and how Summer has this aching and bittersweet finality to it. With the quartet as a whole, but really with reading Summer, it reminded me how I find comfort in stories being able to be these portals to sentimentality and also being so practical. Since Smith does take this quartet with primarily giving commentary on world events within these past 4 years or so. And Smith reminds me that there's always this sense of feeling kind of duped or tricked into stories, making me feel so convinced that by Smith citing real world events through storytelling, through fiction, reminds me of why I seek stories so much, even beyond books themselves, and how my exposure to stories is always a conscious one, even as a reader or a movie watcher or whatever else, really reminding me kind of what the action of reading reminds me of how I feel, which is reminding me that sometimes I wonder if it's really the reading that I love doing so much or the ability to be able to think about what I read. So that's something I've always wondered about with how much I've been reading these past few years, and that's why I feel like I should mention Summer in this list. Up next, I have Gilead by Marilynne Robinson. This is a story about a man named John who is writing a letter to his son because John is dying. More specifically, John is a minister, so he does combat his own mortality with his spirituality. And because the whole book is told within John's, or from John's perspective, it feels like the tone is fading, and it almost kind of feels painful to feel like John is, in a sense, trying to prove that he was worth being alive. And because it's me, I made that sound really depressing, from a reading standpoint, but it doesn't really ever take on that triumphal sense either from Robinson's perspective. Instead, I was constantly fascinated both intellectually through the narrative, kind of wondering how this story was going to shape or really how it was going to keep going, but also managed to engage me enough to where I felt I was engaged as a form of entertainment through reading fiction. And Robinson does a great job at embedding these theological tones without feeling like it's projecting onto me as a reader, or really even using John as a vehicle to talk about these things. It always felt like it was coming from John first, and then the theme always happened to be second. Gilead is actually part of a trilogy, with Gilead being first, and Home, which is the second book in the series, is actually one of my favorite books ever. But the reason I put Gilead on this list is because I feel like I need Gilead to appreciate Home so much. Because without John as a character, I wouldn't have felt or really understood that context for the relationship of family whenever Home talks about a boy named Jack and the Botten family. And I think it just goes to show that Robinson is a master at creating these profiles of characters that feel so interconnected and accountable and responsible for the people in their lives. Whether you're a son or a daughter or a child and you have a parent or whoever else is in your life, I think what Robinson really taps into with her other works, thinking of housekeeping as well, I think she really also, shrouds this all in a weird, mysterious way too with setting. Her settings are somehow completely ominous, but feeling so essential to how they affect the characters too. So I'm only like really excited for whenever I read Jack, which comes out like literally within the next 2 weeks. Now, instead of there being the Gilead trilogy, it's now a tetralogy. Up next, I have Outline by Rachel Cusk. When it comes to literary fiction with meandering characters that just finished having an internal monologue about what they just ate, I feel like out of all of them, that Outline does it best. Outline is loosely about a character named Faye, who really is just a soundboard to these 10 conversations that go on, with each chapter actually being segmented for one of these conversations. But the overall plot is that actually Faye is teaching abroad, a summer writing class, and through these conversations, I think what Cusk is really focusing on is how easy it is to go on tangents that really mimic real life conversation, or more specifically, kind of how we reveal our own insecurities or our own selfishness or whatever else, with maybe the greatest effect being, or the point always maybe being instinctual, that we always try to bring conversations back to ourselves. And it's amazing to me how Cusk orchestrates these conversations with such little input from Faye, because I really do think that's how real life goes whenever we feel like we might just be a side character in someone's real life. And strangely, how I felt like it really reinforced or reminded me of there is this sort of rhetorical concept to the presentation of conversations, which sounds exactly like something I would overthink about and find interesting. So I know that's not for everybody, but because it made me think so much about sort of the inner psychology of that kind of stuff, I really liked this book, so I wanted to mention it here too. Up next, I have The Hours by Michael Cunningham. I feel like this is a weird one to mention here because a part of it is a partial homage to Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. It follows 3 women, and one of those women actually being Woolf herself writing Mrs. Dalloway. Another woman is named Mrs. Brown, and she's actually reading Mrs. Dalloway while yearning to retreat from her family. And finally, we have Clarissa, who is very much like the character Clarissa in Mrs. Dalloway, as she just wants to throw a party. Through each of these women, I really felt there was a collective empathy about just how hard life is sometimes. And it made me wonder how we can yearn for a connection without the default being that to do so would require so much privacy that these women feel like they need. Woolf herself experienced alienation, Mrs. Brown is dealing with isolation, and Clarissa clings to people that only ever make her feel more lonely. This book is very melancholic, which feels true to Woolf in that sense, but because of Cunningham's writing, it felt really accessible, and I basically binge read it. If you also haven't seen the Hours movie, if you've read the Hours book already, I highly recommend watching the movie, and also, it made me cry, so maybe you shouldn't watch it. You can release that breath you were holding, because now I'm going to mention The Idiot by Elif Batuman. So I feel like I had to have at least one book that represented my sad girl fiction, because I really do feel like I gravitate towards books that do have these young adults stepping into their adulthood for the first time. But I really still haven't read anything quite like The Idiot with Celine, who's our main character, who has such a strong sense of voice. The book feels like this Frankenstein of a great coming-of-age story, but also has like the deep pensiveness of a Tolstoy novel, to which I say, please refrain from picking up your pitchforks at the Tolstoy reference, because I would mention him in this list if I could. What I like about Celine so much is because whether it's her figuring out email in the early 2000s or having this larger sort of confrontation with the cultural disconnect being Turkish American, I feel like she just really relishes in learning and yearning about more about what she can learn from life, even if it means getting distracted by basically e-boys before they were e-boys. But what I really like is that Celine is just so committed to whatever she's focused on, whether that be her enrollment at Harvard or reading Russian literature or having unrequited crushes. It's this energy with reacting to life that when I feel like we're all younger, we feel like the energy never stops until we're truly tested, in Celine's case, with a literal change in perspective. Because to me, through Celine, I feel like growing up is all about figuring out or telling ourselves what we're really cut out for and what we're not. So truly probably my favorite coming-of-age fiction book for like all of this criteria at least. I do want to remind everyone that this was a finalist for the Pulitzer, so not that prizes like matter at all too much, but I feel like this is such an underrated finalist that not a lot of people know about it. Up next, more people probably expected me to mention this, but I want to mention A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. And I don't think this book is objectively great because I do think it has a lot of flaws, but reading this was a very rare moment for me where I willingly indulged in my own emotional capacity to a work of fiction. And in a way, because truthfully I feel like this book has a lot of outlandish stuff going on, I do like that Yanagihara put it in there because I feel like for me personally, she was reminding me, hey, this is fiction. And I know this book has a lot of controversy, but to me, I feel like in a way an author can excel at doing that by, even for the smallest moment, convincing you that fiction's only job is to entertain you or to sell you a story, and I was very much sold. Now going back to personally speaking, I really do like this book because I say it all the time, but I think it's probably the best book on friendship I've ever read. It feels really organic, and how characters really are shaped by these relationships that either feel eventually overextended or not necessary anymore. But we can still cherish those memories even if they're long past, and that's actually how this book ends, which is also why I really enjoyed it. I want to preface my number one pick by saying that technically speaking, it's all one book if you just imagine it's all condensed together, and it's the Neapolitan novels by Elena Ferrante, which is my substitute for Steve's The Interestings, because if you really are looking for a book that champions like a group of people throughout the years and getting to know them and what their lives are like, I feel like you could pick nothing better than this series. I've already done a whole video on this series, so I'll just try to abbreviate here. At the basic level, this series covers a girl named Elena Greco and her friend Lila, and it follows their lives from girlhood to adulthood within the backdrop of Naples, Italy. And whether it's confirming aspirations or going through heartbreak or whatever thing that makes this all sound like a soap opera, the story successfully never detracts from Elena's internal monologue being the core voice throughout all of these books, but pretending, again, this is one book. And the book doesn't put Elena like on a pedestal or anything because she does make her own mistakes and she thinks for a very long time about them. But her missteps always feel very lucid and strangely familiar, possibly because Ferrante never has Elena dwell on what could have been, which is way different from feeling like you have to rely on the hope for the future. Because Ferrante understands that to be a woman, you have in a way your life shaped for you. And it's Elena's long journey, and not really even Elena herself, but other characters, including Lila, who are trying to live their own lives and prove themselves in the process. I've never read a book that's so opposite of my real life, but I feel like it taps into this universal consciousness about people just wanting to experience or like to live life, if I could just put it so simply. Figuring out what we want in life and how we can self-actualize to it without feeling like when we might compensate for things, it's not from being separate from our own decision to do that. So those are my 10 books, and I'm very exhausted, but I am definitely going to be tagging some people because if I've been put through this very unexpected hell, it would be a comfort to me if also other people did this to agonize over. So I will be tagging Claire from Claire Reads Books, Matthew Sharapa, Jen from Insert Literary Pun Here, Eric Carl Anderson, Rincey Reed, Ben from Doom Antidote, CJ at CJ Reads, Lucy Rutherford, Jalen from The Bar in the Bookcase, Natalie from Curious Reader, and finally Apocalypse Reads, who is a newer booktuber to me, but I've been really enjoying Apocalyptic Reads content. So that's my list. I would love to know what your thoughts on these books are. Again, like thinking of all the books published in the 21st century, this was really hard to think over, but I found it really great to figure out the reasons why I picked what I did, and I just really enjoyed that process. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.